Namaste. My name is Kirti, and on behalf of Himalayan Yoga Association, I welcome you all to this online teacher training course. I am a teacher here at Himalayan Yoga Association, and I will be taking you through the concepts and details of the human body and yoga altogether. Let's hope you enjoy this course. Let's start.
Namaste and welcome back to the online yoga teacher training course. In today's video, we are going to discuss the anatomy and the structure of the pelvic girdle along with the attachment of the muscles which makes it more functional. But before we go ahead and do that, we are going to chant the Gayatri mantra together in the beginning of every session like we always do. So simply adopt a mudra of your choice as you're sitting in any meditative posture. Close your eyes, roll your shoulders to the back, lengthen your spine upwards, and allow yourself to focus on your breath and only on your breath. Try to get comfortable with the habit of not doing anything. As long as you don't have any thoughts popping up in your head, it can be considered a meditative activity in itself. An easy way to keep thoughts away is to simply pay all of your attention to the inhalations and exhalations as you breathe completely and deeply every time. Now after a few breaths, slowly bring your hands in front of your chest in Namaskara Sthiti. Touch the heart center with the back of your thumbs. If you know the mantra, you can chant it with me. Otherwise, you can always chant it afterwards. So slowly breathe in once. Om Bhur Bhuva Swaha Tatsaviturvarenyam Bhargo Devasya Dhimahi Dhiyo Yona Prachodayat. Having absorbed the vibration and the effect of the mantra, let's generate some energy between our palms by rubbing them against each other. After you feel the energy being created, you can transfer this energy to your eyes by covering your eyes with your palms. Then you can massage your face, the back of your neck, and anywhere else you wish to transfer this energy to. Once again, before you open your eyes, fold your palms, bow down to the universal truth, and with a few blinks, expose your eyes to light again. Welcome back. So, the pelvic joint or the pelvis region of the human body is one half of the entire appendicular skeletal system. If you remember the appendicular skeletal system, that it is one half of the entire human skeletal system. The human skeletal system divided into two parts, the axial skeletal system which runs along the midline of the body, and the appendicular skeletal system which deals with the limbs, the arms and the legs of the human body. The pelvic joint is one very important component because it deals with the lower portions of the appendicular skeletal system. In this video, we are going to discuss the various bones which form the hip joint, the ligaments which help stabilize this joint, and the muscles which make and stabilize the movement and the function of the entire pelvic region. Now, the pelvic region is also including the sacrum part of the spine as well as the coccyx part of the spine. Even though they have lost their different bones and they are a part of the axial skeletal system, they are the connection between the axial and the appendicular skeletal system, But in today's video, we are just going to discuss the anatomy and structure of the hip joint, which is a ball and socket joint, and not the connection between the spine and the pelvis bone. Moving on, this is all the important names that you need to remember if you are going to understand the entire anatomy and structure of the pelvic region. I want you to go through all of these names before I go ahead and explain to you all of the anatomy and structure of the pelvic joint on a human skeletal model. Different bones: pelvis, femur, the ligaments: acetabular labrum, ligamentum teres, iliofemoral ligaments, pubofemoral ligaments, 𝐂𝐞𝐫𝐿, transverse acetabular ligament, iliotibial band. Now this iliotibial band is a tendon, but I've included it as a part of the connective tissue. The various muscles: gluteus minimus, gluteus medius, gluteus maximus, which are gluteal muscles forming the hips, the adductor muscles for the inner thigh, the iliopsoas and the rectus femoris, sartorius, external rotators, which is a combination of muscles at the buttocks area responsible for rotating the hip joint, and the hamstrings, which run along the back of the skull. Now let's understand, these are all terms, let's understand how and what makes the entire hip joint as it is. Now, the pelvis bone in itself is a combination of three different bones coming together. These are the pelvis bones right here, also known as the hip bones. These are two different separate bones which are not really an entire entity in itself, but they are parallelly placed against each other with the help of the connection of the sacrum as well as the coccyx part of the spine. Without the sacrum and the coccyx, naturally these two pelvic bones, the hip bones, they would not be aligned and they would not have much connection and movement as they offer to us. The pelvis bone, even though it looks like a very big bone in itself, but they are naturally fused together, and this whole function happens by the time we reach our puberty. It's formed by three different bones known as the ilium bone, which is the biggest part of the bone, of the hip bone, the ischium bone, which is the lower part of the pelvis bone, beginning at the end of the ilium bone, as well as the pubis bone, which is the smallest portion or the the most inferior part of the entire pelvis bone. These three different bones, they come together to form this entire entity, that is the entire pelvis bone, and they fuse together into a non-movable joint in itself. That means they do not have the potential of moving together, but of course they are there and they are providing the function as it is. The entire hip bone is a very important structure. It has various protrudements coming out. It has a lot of space in various regions for the transport and mechanism of the various muscles, the various nerves that spread through the entire human body. Of course, if this is the space where the spinal cord ends, then the various empty spaces, each and every protrudement, each and every structure of the entire skeletal system, even though it looks purposeless, but still it does provide some form of attachment to the various nerves and the various ligaments and the muscles of the human body. So, talking about the entire structure, we are just going to refer this whole structure as the pelvis bone and not going to refer to it as the various names that it has, which are ilium, ischium and pubis. The entire pelvic bone has a socket end of the ball and socket joint that the hip joint is. The pelvic region of the human body is the true ball and socket joint. That means that the ball end of the femur fits perfectly into the socket end of the pelvic joint. If you pay attention over here, then as compared to the shoulder joint, which is another ball and socket joint, the socket end of the pelvic region is much deeper as compared to the shoulder joint. That is the reason why the pelvic joint is much stronger as compared to the shoulder joint. At the same time, the pelvic joint is less mobile as compared to the shoulder joint. That's because the purpose of the pelvic joint is to bear more weight rather than offering more movement. And that is the reason why it has so many different attachments of different muscles running through it. That's because the weight of the entire body rests on these hip bones from above. The femur bone, let's talk about the femur bone first. The femur bone in itself, as this ball circuit, the ball area of the femur bone, which is the proximal end of the femur bone, this whole thing is called as the femoral head of the bone, and this is the area which fits perfectly into the socket structure of the pelvic region, which you can see right here, the very deep socket structure of the pelvic region. This socket structure of the pelvic region is called as acetabulum. Acetabulum is the space where the femoral head fits perfectly so that it can offer its various movement. The pelvic bone is attached to the femur bone with the help of various ligaments in the form of the Iliofemoral ligament, which is also the biggest and the strongest ligament in the human body. The pubofemoral ligament, which you can easily understand, that is the connection between the femur bone as well as the pubis area of the pelvic bone, and the ischio-femoral ligament, which is the connection between the ischium part or the structure of the pubis bone, which is formed with the help of the ischium bone, as well as the femoral head. All of these three ligaments, they help in stabilizing and forming the synovial cavity of the pubic joint or the hip bone as it is. If you pay attention, then the entire acetabulum over here, if you ever get a chance to observe a human skeleton in front of you, then you'll realize that all of these three different bones, the ilium, the ischium, as well as the pubis bone, they come together to create the acetabulum structure, which is the perfect socket in nature, and it's a beauty of the nature in itself, how these three different bones, they're shaped and placed together to form this hollow structure which places and houses the femoral head so perfectly in itself. Of course, there is some missing space inside of it, and that is covered up with the help of the transverse acetabular ligament, which covers the entire acetabulum structure and forms it a complete collar inside which the femoral head sits perfectly. It creates the transverse acetabular ligament is basically a small ligament which is connecting between the pubis as well as the ischium bones, and it covers and creates a complete round ring-like structure so that the femoral head sits perfectly and is less prone to dislocations or slipping out of its place where it's supposed to. If the transverse acetabular ligament was absent in the anatomy of the human joint, then I imagine that the femoral head would be more prone to dislocations if not for the transverse acetabular ligament. There is one more very important ligament which does not really play a major role in the movement of the hip joint, but it has its own minute role to play in the anatomy of the hip joint. As I stretch this femur bone away from, if you can see it right here, this small thin thread right here is called as the acetabular labrum. The acetabular, sorry. If I stretch this femur bone away from the pubic area, then you'll see this thin thread right here, which is a hollow space, sort of a ligament, a fibrocartilaginous structure in itself, which is connected from the femoral head, and it's connected to the very deepest part of the acetabulum. This whole thing is called as the Ligamentum Teres. Basically, even though it does not provide any structure and function to the stability of the joint, but it does provide an arterial base so that there is minute and even diminishing supply of blood vessels to the femoral head so that the bone in itself keeps the entire hip joint healthy and active. Apart from all of these things, all of these different ligaments, namely the Ligamentum Teres, which is right here, there is one more very important cartilaginous structure, which helps in maintaining the health of the entire hip joint. That thing is called as the acetabular labrum. Now you can understand from the name itself that it is a part of the acetabulum portion of the pelvic joint. That means that it is somewhere on the outer edge of the acetabulum. It's a very fibrous cartilaginous structure, something similar to the labrum that we find on the glenohumeral joint, which basically works as in maximizing or deepening the socket end of the hip joint. The whole purpose of this is to widen the collar so that the hip joint fits more perfectly inside the femoral head hits more perfectly inside the pubic area of the hip joint. This is all about the different ligaments that connect the pelvis region to the femur bone. Let's talk about the different muscles that come together as it is. Now, let's talk about the different muscles that help in stabilizing and functioning of the entire pelvic region of the human body. The first set of muscles that you see right here is the gluteus minimus, the gluteus medius, and the gluteus maximus, which are located at the back of the human body, at the posterior end of the human body, and these are the muscles which entirely create the buttocks region of the spine of the human body. The gluteus maximus is the biggest set of muscles in the back, and it is the muscle which primarily covers and forms most of the buttocks region. It is also one of the strongest muscles present in the human body because they help in stabilizing the entire pelvic region. At the same time, have you realized that anytime you're trying to walk around or do any sort of movement with one or the other legs, there's always this constant shift of weight that happens in the left and the right side of the body. It is the role of the gluteal muscles, the buttocks muscles, to stabilize the body. Otherwise, these pelvic regions, these two different pelvis bones, they would be dislocated from the structure that they create in itself. The second set of muscles which are connected to the entire pelvic region is the adductor muscles. The adductor muscles are basically starting from the pelvis bone and they run across on the inner thighs of the legs or the medial end of the legs. The adductor muscles, as the name suggests in itself, are responsible for the adduction of the legs, or in other words, we can say that the adductor muscles, they are responsible for bringing one leg closer to the other. The Iliopsoas muscles are the muscles which are responsible for helping you raise the thighs upwards whenever you're trying to make any movements. The iliopsoas starts from somewhere in the lower part of the spine and they run across from the back and cover up the front side of the pelvic region to join up to the back of the femur bone. That means the entire anterior portion of the hip joint is covered with the iliopsoas muscles, and they work in accordance with the rectus femoris, which forms one of the major portions of the quadriceps muscles of the thighs. The iliopsoas and the rectus femoris are both responsible for the movement of the legs, primarily responsible for the movement of the thigh muscles. Anytime you're trying to raise your knees upwards close to your chest, the iliopsoas are making the pulling action happen from the backside, and as well as the strength is also happening from the rectus femoris, which is present on the thigh muscles. The Sartorius muscle, which is also the longest muscle in the human body, is running from the pubic bone and it runs across the entire thigh and joins up at the top or the proximal end of the tibial bone. The Sartorius muscle is responsible for, or it is the connection between the lower part of the leg and the pelvis region. The Sartorius muscle is responsible for the functioning of the knee joint. Anytime you're trying to bend the knee, anytime you're trying to work with the lower part of the leg or the distal end of the knee joint, the Sartorius muscle becomes active. It helps in rotating the leg, it helps in stabilizing the leg as it is, and as I've already told you, it is the connection between the hip joint as well as the knee joint, the leg joint. There is a small group of muscles called as the external rotators, which are placed somewhere around here and they are connected with the femur bone and the posterior end of the pubic bone. The external rotators, as the name suggests, are responsible for externally rotating the thighs outwards anytime you're trying to twist the leg. Now remember, the knee joint is just a hinge joint, it is not a pivot joint, but the nature of the ball and socket joint also includes rotation in itself. And because of this nature of the ball and socket joint, the external rotators are able to rotate the legs inwards or outwards, and this is where the small group of muscles which are located at the deepest end of the entire human body, we can say that they are on the innermost layer of the gluteal muscles. They are even deeper than the gluteal muscles. They are responsible for rotating the leg. And of course, the last set of muscles that run across the back side of the human legs, they are called the hamstrings, and they are responsible for extending as well as pulling the leg backwards. They, along with the sartorius muscles, they work as agonists and antagonists, of course, in the movement of the joints. Remember, any set of muscle that you see is responsible for moving the lower portion of the limb or the human body as it is. For example, the biceps are responsible for working with the forearm muscles. The finger extenders which are placed on the forearm are responsible for moving the fingers. Similarly, the hamstrings, they're responsible for working with the leg or the part of the leg which is under the knee joint, as well as the gluteus muscles. They're responsible for not just stabilizing the buttocks, but they're also responsible for stabilizing the thighs. This is everything you need to know about the skeletal, the pelvic region of the human body. I hope you found today's video informative. I would, as if you have been able to completely understand the structure and the anatomy of the pubic joint, I want you to think about the alignment of various asanas that you perform. For instance, as we perform the triangle pose, we externally rotate the front leg in perpendicular to the back leg, and all of this movement is living and happening because of various muscles found in the human body. While you're doing these poses, as you get into the proper alignment, you feel certain stretches, certain stress on various parts of the muscles. Just while you're practicing these muscles, I want you to go ahead and remember all of these different joints, different names, and different muscles as well, and think about which part of the body is getting a stretch, which part of the body is getting a stimulation, depending on the various shapes you create in accordance with the yoga asanas that you perform. I will see you again next time. Until then, thank you and namaste.